Run every test.
Don't speak to me like that.
I'm your wife.
The hospital corridor went dead silent when Naomi looked her husband in the eye and said 4 words that made a mafia boss's hands shake for the first time in his life. Run every test. She wasn't crying. She was daring him to find out exactly how wrong he'd been. If you believe truth deserves a fair trial before judgment does, hit subscribe. This story is for the ones who stand their ground when the world doubts them, not the cowards hiding behind anonymous letters. Like this video if you're rooting for Naomi, and stay close. The real villain hasn't shown their face yet. The machines beeped in that sterile, indifferent rhythm hospitals specialize in, a rhythm that doesn't care whose life is falling apart in the hallway outside. Naomi stood with her back straight and her chin level, the way she'd learned to stand through a decade of gang wars, hostile takeovers, and one memorable afternoon in a parking garage that still visited her in dreams. Kang Min-jae stood 6 feet away, close enough to touch, too far to matter. Run every test you can think of, she said again, quieter this time, like she was tired of repeating herself to a man who used to trust her without asking. 6 hours earlier, none of this existed. 6 hours earlier, Min-jae had been a man with a wife, a newborn son, and the kind of empire that made lesser criminals cross the street when they saw his car coming. Then an envelope arrived. No return address, no signature, just a single typed sentence claiming the child sleeping in the nursery upstairs wasn't his blood. Poison doesn't need a signature to work. It just needs a man arrogant enough to drink it without checking the label. He'd summoned her to the mansion's great room like it was a courtroom, and he'd already decided the verdict. Relatives sat around the edges of the room pretending not to watch, the way people pretend not to watch a car crash while filming it on their phones. When Naomi didn't crumble, didn't beg, didn't perform the grief he expected, he mistook her composure for guilt. Bodyguards walked her out of her own home while her mother-in-law refused to meet her eyes. Here's the thing about accusing an innocent woman in front of an audience. It only works if she flinches. Naomi didn't flinch. She got in her car, drove herself to the city's top medical center, and requested every DNA test known to modern science, plus 2 independent labs Min-jae's lawyers didn't even know existed, plus a notarized witness to watch the whole process, because if he wanted proof, she was going to hand him so much proof he'd drown in it. You could have just answered the accusation, Min-jae said now, standing in the hallway, voice rough with something that hadn't fully become an apology yet. I did answer it, Naomi said. You just didn't like the answer being silence. Somewhere in this story, a man who's spent 10 years standing at Min-jae's right hand is smiling into a glass of expensive whiskey, congratulating himself on a plan well executed. He doesn't have a name yet in this chapter. He doesn't need one. All he needs is patience, and he has plenty. The patient kind of evil that doesn't announce itself, just waits by the door holding your coat and calling itself family. While the nurse drew blood for the 3rd independent sample, hospital security pulled footage at Naomi's request. Routine, she said, though nothing about tonight was routine. On the grainy black and white feed, a woman none of the staff recognized slipped through the mansion's East Wing entrance 3 days before the envelope appeared. Not a guest, not staff. A shadow with excellent timing and someplace better to be before anyone thought to ask her name. Min-jae watched the footage over the detective's shoulder, jaw tightening. Who is that? Nobody answered. Nobody had an answer yet. That's the uncomfortable thing about betrayal. It rarely announces its face before it's already rearranged your entire life. Naomi sat in a plastic hospital chair, their son finally asleep against her shoulder, and looked at the man she married like she was seeing the shape of a stranger wearing his face. You've survived assassination attempts without blinking, she said. But one anonymous letter, and you threw me out like garbage day came early. He didn't have an answer for that either. For the first time in his adult life, Kang Min-jae, a man who made grown killers apologize for interrupting his dinner, had absolutely nothing to say. If you've ever watched someone trust a stranger's lie faster than they trusted a decade of proof standing right in front of them, hit subscribe now, because only the manipulators and the cowards in this story are hoping you look away before the truth comes out. Everyone else stays for what happens next. The lab door opened. A woman in scrubs stepped out holding a folder, her expression unreadable. We have your first results, she said. Naomi didn't move. Min-jae stopped breathing. The folder sat in the lab technician's hands like something radioactive. Naomi didn't reach for it. She'd learned a long time ago that in rooms like this, showing hunger for an answer was a way of handing someone else power over how you'd react to it. Preliminary markers only, the technician said. Full results in 6 hours. I just wanted you to know the sample's processed clean. No contamination, no errors. Whatever this says, it'll hold up anywhere. Court, press, family dinner. Anywhere. Min-jae exhaled like a man who'd been holding his breath since the envelope arrived. 6 more hours. 6 hours was nothing to a man who once waited 11 months for a rival syndicate to make a single mistake. 6 hours was an eternity to a man waiting to find out if his own life was a lie. Naomi stood, shifted their son onto her other shoulder, and walked toward the window without looking at her husband. Seoul glittered below them, indifferent to the small implosion happening on the 4th floor of a private hospital. Go home, Min-jae, she said. Go find out who wrote that letter. I'm not going anywhere until this is finished, but you clearly have somewhere else to be. He almost argued. Almost said something about staying by her side, about making it right immediately. But the detective he'd brought, a quiet, methodical man named Song, who'd worked for the family longer than some of Min-jae's own siblings had been alive, cleared his throat from the doorway. Sir, the footage. You'll want to see the rest of it. They reviewed it in a private office 2 floors down, the kind of room hospitals keep for delivering bad news gently, though nothing about tonight had been gentle. The security feed showed the unfamiliar woman again, mid-30s, dark coat, moving with the kind of confidence that suggested she'd been inside the mansion before, or had been told exactly where to walk to avoid the cameras that mattered. She entered through the East Wing service door, Song said. That door requires a code. Only 4 people have it. Min-jae's jaw worked. Name them. Song did. 3 were groundskeepers who'd worked the property for over a decade. The 4th was Young-sik, the head of household staff, a man who'd been hired the same year Min-jae took over the organization from his father, a man who'd held Min-jae's son at his naming ceremony 3 weeks ago and cried real tears doing it. Bring him in, Min-jae said, but Young-sik was already gone. A text message had gone out to the household coordinator 40 minutes earlier, a resignation, effective immediately, family emergency, apologies for the short notice. No family emergency existed. Nobody could reach him. His phone rang twice and then went to a voicemail box that had apparently never been set up. People don't resign by text message unless they're running from something, Song said quietly, or unless someone's paying them enough to disappear fast. Min-jae sat back, and for a moment the Mafia boss disappeared entirely, replaced by a tired man doing math he didn't like the answer to. Young-sik hadn't acted alone. He didn't have the imagination or the resources to forge a claim this specific, this cruelly timed. Someone had used him. Someone with access to the house, to the timeline, to the exact moment Min-jae's paranoia would be at its most flammable. Somewhere across the city, in an office with a view he'd worked a decade to earn the right to enjoy, a man Min-jae trusted completely poured 2 fingers of whiskey and allowed himself exactly one small private smile. Not yet, he thought. Let him panic a little longer. Panic makes men careless, and careless men name their heirs in haste, or don't name them at all. Back at the hospital, Naomi stood at the window with her son sleeping against her chest, watching the city lights blur slightly with exhaustion she refused to call tears. She didn't know yet about Young-sik, or the mystery woman, or the whiskey being poured in celebration of her humiliation. All she knew was that somewhere in the last 6 hours, the life she'd built brick by loyal brick had been set on fire by someone patient enough to strike the match and walk away clean. The lab door would open again in 6 hours. But the real question wasn't whether the results would clear her name. It was whether Min-jae would still have an empire left to protect her with, once he found out exactly who'd been sitting at his table this whole time. 6 hours felt shorter than the 6 days it took Min-jae to fall asleep after his father died. He spent them the way he spent every crisis, moving, because stillness left too much room for doubt to sit down and get comfortable. He went first to Young-sik's apartment, a modest 1-bedroom in a quiet district that felt deliberately unremarkable, like a man who'd learned early that the safest place to hide money is somewhere nobody bothers to look twice. The apartment was empty, not ransacked. Emptied. Drawers closed. Bed made. A man who packs like that isn't running in panic. He's executing a plan someone gave him weeks in advance. He didn't do this alone, Song said, standing in the doorway, scanning the room with the practiced boredom of a man who'd seen 100 rooms exactly like it. Look at the bank statement on the counter. He left it, deliberately I'd guess. Min-jae picked it up. A single deposit, 3 weeks earlier, routed through 2 shell accounts before landing in Yong-sik's name. The amount would have taken him 11 years to save on a household coordinator's salary. Someone had paid him enough to disappear and made sure the paper trail was just visible enough to be found, but not visible enough to say who'd sent it. Someone wanted us to know he was paid, Min-jae said slowly, without wanting us to know by who. Or, Song said, someone wanted to buy time. A distraction with Yong-sik's name on it keeps us looking at the wrong door while the right one stays open. Min-jae's phone buzzed. A text from the hospital. Results are in. Please return. He left the apartment without touching anything else, the bank statement burning a hole in his jacket pocket like it might catch fire before he made it back to Naomi. She was exactly where he'd left her. By the window, their son now awake and quiet in her arms, watching his mother's face with the unblinking attention only infants and very old men seem capable of. She didn't look up when Min-jae entered. She'd stopped needing his attention hours ago. That particular hunger had burned itself out somewhere around hour 3, replaced by something colder and more durable. The technician returned with a folder considerably thicker than the last one. All 3 labs, she said. Independent processing, no shared data, no possibility of cross-contamination. The results are identical across every sample. She set the folder down and didn't open it. That was Naomi's job, and everyone in the room seemed to understand that without being told. Naomi opened it herself, scanned the summary page once, then a second time. Not because she doubted it, but because some truths deserve to be read twice before you let yourself feel anything about them. Then she turned the folder around and set it on the table so Min-jae could read it without her having to say the words out loud. Probability of paternity, 99.999%, their son. Unquestionably, scientifically, indisputably his. Min-jae read it 3 times. Something in his chest that had been clenched since the envelope arrived finally let go, all at once, like a fist unclenching after holding a rock too long. He didn't cry. Men like Min-jae had trained the reflex out of themselves decades ago, but his hands shook, just slightly, holding a piece of paper that weighed nothing and had nearly cost him everything. Naomi, he started. Don't, she said, not cruelly, just tired. Not yet. There's more in that folder, and I don't think either of us is going to like it. She was right. Beneath the paternity summary sat a second report, one the lab hadn't been asked for but had flagged anyway because thoroughness has a way of surfacing things nobody wanted found. Buried in the hospital's original intake records, filed the week their son was born, was evidence of tampering. A single data field, altered months after the original entry, changing a blood type notation just enough to plant a seed of doubt that would only bloom if someone went looking for it later. Someone had planted this before the child was even born. This isn't betrayal, Song said quietly, reading over Min-jae's shoulder. Betrayal happens in a moment. This is architecture. Someone built this months ago and waited for the right time to knock the walls down. Naomi looked at her husband for the first time since the results arrived, and what was in her eyes wasn't relief. It was something harder. Someone spent months planning to destroy us, she said, and you helped them do it in one afternoon, for free. Min-jae had no defense for that. None. For the second time that night, the feared boss of Seoul's most dangerous organization sat in complete, humiliated silence, while somewhere across the city, the architect of his unraveling checked his watch and calmly poured a second drink, confident the hardest part was already behind him. He was wrong. But he didn't know that yet. Song went quiet in the way he always did right before he said something Min-jae didn't want to hear. It was a specific kind of silence, the kind that made grown men in the organization nervous. Because Song didn't waste words, and when he finally chose them, they usually cost someone their position, their freedom, or their life. The tampering, he said. It wasn't done remotely. Whoever altered that blood type field had physical access to the hospital's internal record system. That's not a hacker in another country. That's someone who walked into this building, or paid someone who did. How many people have that kind of access? Min-jae asked. To the hospital's system? Dozens. But to know which field to change and exactly when your son would be born, and which nurses log in to use without raising flags, that's not a stranger. That's someone who had detailed knowledge of your family's private medical arrangements months in advance. Naomi's arms tightened slightly around their son. Who has that kind of access, Min-jae? He didn't answer right away, because the honest answer was a shorter list than either of them wanted to admit. Family. Senior staff. The 3 or 4 men who'd sat at his right hand long enough to know which hospital Naomi would deliver in before the public announcement even went out. His phone rang. He almost didn't answer it, but it was Ji-hoon, his second-in-command, the man who'd been at his side for 10 years, who'd stood as best man at his wedding, who'd held his son 3 weeks ago at the naming ceremony, and said, with what looked like real emotion, that he'd never seen Min-jae happier. "Boss," Ji-hoon said, voice tight with what sounded like genuine concern. "I heard about the letter. I came as soon as I could. Is the baby? He's fine," Min-jae said. "Naomi's fine. We're at the hospital." "Thank God," Ji-hoon said, and something in his voice cracked just slightly, just enough to sound like relief and not like a man checking whether his plan was still on schedule. "I've already put people on finding whoever sent that envelope. Whoever did this to your family, boss. They're going to regret it." Min-jae felt something in his chest ease, just slightly, hearing it. Ji-hoon had never once, in 10 years, given him a reason to doubt him. Not during the merger wars, not during the 3 assassination attempts, not during the 6-month stretch when half the syndicate thought Min-jae was too young and too soft to hold his father's empire together. Ji-hoon had stood in doorways with a gun more than once, so Min-jae wouldn't have to. "Find Yong-sik," Min-jae said, "and find out who paid him." "Already on it," Ji-hoon said. "I'll call the second I have anything." He hung up, and Min-jae allowed himself a small, exhausted relief, the kind that comes from remembering you're not entirely alone in a burning building. Naomi watched his face soften and felt something colder settle into her own. "You believe him," she said. "It wasn't a question. Ji-hoon's been loyal for 10 years. "So was I," Naomi said quietly, "and it took 1 letter for that to stop mattering. He had no answer for that. Not one that didn't sound hollow even to himself. If you've ever trusted the wrong person simply because they'd earned it a long time ago, comment below and tell Naomi she's not wrong to be careful. This story isn't for the ones who forgive too fast. It's for the ones who make people earn it back, slow and deliberate, the way trust is supposed to be rebuilt." Hit subscribe if you're staying to find out exactly how far this goes, because the people closest to Min-jae haven't finished showing their hands yet. Song excused himself to make a call, stepping into the hallway, phone pressed to his ear. He came back 4 minutes later, expression unreadable in a way Min-jae had learned to recognize as trouble. "The offshore account that paid Yong-sik," Song said. "I traced the routing through the second shell. It took some work, but I found where the money originated before it got laundered clean." "And?" Song hesitated. 1 beat, 2. The particular hesitation of a man about to burn down a friendship with a single sentence. "It's an account tied to the organization's internal expense system," Song said. "Boss, it's one of ours." The room went very still. Somewhere in the building, a monitor beeped its indifferent rhythm, utterly unbothered by the fact that the floor had just tilted sideways under everyone standing in it. "One of ours," Min-jae repeated, like saying it slower might change what it meant. "The account routes through 3 shells before it lands offshore," Song said, pulling up the trail on his tablet. "But the origin point is an internal expense account used for logistics and security contracting. That account has 6 authorized signatories. All 6 are senior members of your organization. 6 names. Min-jae knew every one of them personally, had eaten dinner in their homes, attended their children's birthdays, trusted them with parts of his empire he wouldn't trust to blood relatives. Somewhere among 6 familiar faces sat someone who'd spent months building a lie specific enough to nearly cost him his marriage and his son's place in the family he was born to inherit. "Get me the transaction logs," Min-jae said. "Every withdrawal in the last 4 months. I want to know who authorized it." "Boss, that could take." "I don't care how long it takes. Get it." Naomi watched this unfold from the window, their son finally asleep again, and felt something she hadn't expected to feel yet, a small, cautious flicker of respect. Not forgiveness, that was still hours, maybe days away, sitting somewhere she couldn't reach yet. But respect, watching him turn his fury toward the actual problem instead of toward her. "You're finally asking the right questions," she said. "I should have asked them 6 hours ago." "Yes," she said simply. "You should have." He didn't argue. There was nothing left to argue with. The DNA results sat on the table between them like a verdict already read aloud, and now the only question left was who'd forced the trial in the first place. Song's tablet chimed. He read the screen, and his expression did something Min-jae had rarely seen it do. It flickered, just for a second, into something like disbelief before flattening back into professional calm. "The withdrawals," Song said slowly, "all 6 of them, over 4 months, small amounts. Never enough to trigger a review. Structured exactly like someone who knew precisely where the internal audit thresholds sat. Who authorized them? They alternate, different signatory each time. Which means either 6 people are working together, Or one person has access to sign as any of the six, Naomi finished quietly, still watching the city outside the window. Both men turned to look at her. You said it yourself, she said. Someone who knew exactly which field to change in the hospital record, exactly which door code Yong-sik would use, exactly which internal accounts wouldn't get flagged. That's not six people, Min-jae. That's one person who spent years learning how your entire organization works from the inside, well enough to move through it wearing anyone's name he wants. The room went quiet again. Min-jae's phone buzzed. Ji-hoon, checking in for the third time that night, voice full of concern, offering to come by the hospital in person to help however he could. Min-jae told him to keep working the search for Yong-sik and hung up without really hearing the reply. He didn't want to think it. The thought sat at the edge of his mind like something he could see clearly if he turned his head. And he kept refusing to turn his head, because turning would mean admitting a decade of trust had been sitting inside a lie the entire time, close enough to hold his son at his naming ceremony. Naomi watched him not turn his head, and something in her chest ached for him despite everything, because she recognized the specific grief of realizing the ground beneath you was never solid, and she wouldn't wish that particular vertigo on anyone, not even a man who'd humiliated her in front of his entire family 6 hours earlier. You already suspect someone, she said. Not a question. Min-jae was quiet for a long moment. I don't want to. That's not the same as not suspecting them. He looked at her then, really looked, for the first time since the envelope arrived, like he was seeing not just his wife, but the sharpest, calmest mind in the room, one he'd spent the last 6 hours failing to listen to. No, he admitted. It isn't. Song's tablet chimed again. He read it, went very still, and looked up at Min-jae with the expression of a man about to hand someone a loaded weapon and tell them exactly whose name was carved into the handle. Boss, he said quietly. I found the signature pattern. It's not random. Whoever's been rotating through these accounts, they always sign last, after the others. Every single time. He turned the tablet around. There was only one name that appeared in every single transaction, in a small administrative field nobody usually bothered to check. The approving witness, the final signature required to close the loop. Ji-hoon. Min-jae stared at the name until the letters stopped looking like a name and started looking like a wound. That could be an oversight, he said, and heard how weak it sounded even as it left his mouth. A clerical error. Ji-hoon reviews half the internal paperwork in the organization. His name shows up on things constantly. It doesn't mean. Boss. Song's voice was gentle, which was somehow worse than if he'd been blunt. I cross-referenced the timeline. Ji-hoon approved the increased security budget for the hospital wing 3 months ago. The same budget line that later paid for consulting services that traced to the woman on the security footage. He signed off on Yong-sik's performance review last quarter, praising him, recommending a raise. The same man who vanished by text message tonight with 11 years' salary sitting in his account. And he's the one who suggested, back when Naomi first announced the pregnancy, that the delivery happen at that specific hospital instead of the family's usual private clinic. For better security, he said. Every sentence landed like a brick. Min-jae felt the decade rearranging itself behind his eyes. Every dinner, every late night, every time Ji-hoon had stood in a doorway with a gun so Min-jae wouldn't have to. All of it recoloring itself into something calculated instead of loyal. The worst part wasn't the betrayal. The worst part was how good he'd been at it. 10 years of patience is not a small thing. Most men can't manage 10 days of patience for anything that doesn't involve a paycheck. Naomi hadn't moved from the window, but her voice cut through the room clean and steady. Why now? She said. If he's been building this for months, why choose tonight to send the letter? What changed? Song pulled up one more document, and for the first time all night, his composure actually cracked. Because 3 days ago, boss, you told the senior council you were finally ready to name an heir. You said it privately, in the strategy meeting. Ji-hoon was in that room. Min-jae's stomach dropped through the floor. He had said that. He'd meant Naomi's son, his son, the boy currently asleep against her shoulder, oblivious to the fact that his existence had just detonated the second most powerful man in his father's empire. He panicked, Naomi said quietly, putting it together out loud. If your son is your heir, Ji-hoon's position, everything he spent a decade building toward, disappears the moment that boy is old enough to inherit it instead of him. So he didn't need to destroy your family completely. He just needed to plant enough doubt that you'd question the child's legitimacy long enough to delay naming him. Buy himself time. Maybe convince you to name someone else. Maybe him. It was, Min-jae realized with a kind of sick clarity. elegant. Ji-hoon hadn't needed a war. He'd needed 6 hours of doubt, one envelope, and a husband arrogant enough to believe suspicion faster than he believed a decade of loyalty standing right in front of him. The man hadn't even needed to succeed completely. He'd only needed Min-jae to hesitate. "He's still out there," Min-jae said, standing so fast the chair scraped hard against the floor. "Still calling me, still asking if there's anything he can do to help find Young-sik, the man he paid to disappear." "Don't call him," Song said sharply. "If he suspects we've traced the accounts, he'll run, or worse, he'll finish what he started before we can stop him. We need him to believe he's still safe." Naomi looked at her husband, and for the first time that night, something like alliance passed between them. Not forgiveness, not yet, but a shared enemy is its own kind of temporary bridge. "Then don't act like a man who just found out," she said. "Act like the boss who trusts him completely. One more night. Let him believe it worked." Min-jae's phone lit up in his hand before he could answer her. Ji-hoon's name glowing on the screen, calling for the 4th time that night. If you've ever had to sit across from the person who betrayed you and smile like nothing's wrong, comment below, because Naomi and Min-jae are about to do exactly that, and one wrong flicker in his voice could unravel everything. Subscribe now if you want to see Ji-hoon's face when he realizes the trap already closed around him. Only the ones rooting for the betrayer would want to look away right now. Min-jae took a breath, steadied his voice into the easy, tired warmth of a man who still trusted his oldest friend completely, and answered the call. "Ji-hoon," he said. "Any word on Young-sik?" "Nothing yet, boss," Ji-hoon said, and his voice was perfect, warm, worried, exactly as it had always sounded. "But I'm not stopping until we find whoever did this to your family. You have my word." Min-jae closed his eyes. "I know," he said. "I don't know what I'd do without you." Across the city, Ji-hoon smiled into the phone, utterly unaware that the man on the other end of the line already knew exactly whose word wasn't worth anything at all. The trap didn't need much dressing. Ji-hoon had spent 10 years building his position on being useful, reliable, always one step ahead. So Min-jae simply gave him a chance to be exactly that, one final time. "I want to move the boy and Naomi to the countryside house for a few days," Min-jae told him the next morning, voice heavy with false exhaustion. "Somewhere quiet, away from all this, until we find whoever sent that letter. I need someone I trust completely to handle the security arrangements personally." "Of course, boss," Ji-hoon said, and Min-jae could hear something underneath the words now that he knew to listen for it. Not warmth, but calculation, quiet and immediate. A man rearranging pieces. The countryside house had one road in, minimal staff, and, Song had confirmed within the hour, exactly the kind of isolation a desperate man might mistake for opportunity. Ji-hoon arrived at the property himself that evening, personally overseeing security, which meant personally walking into the one place his own hired men, the same woman from the footage, paid through the same shell accounts, were waiting to finish what the anonymous letter had failed to. He'd decided, somewhere in the last 24 hours, that doubt hadn't been enough. If the family wouldn't fracture on its own, he'd break it by force and inherit the wreckage. He never made it past the front gate. Song's people were already there, quiet and patient, the way men are when they've had a full day to prepare instead of 6 hours to panic. Ji-hoon was disarmed before his hand finished reaching for his weapon, and for the first time in 10 years, Min-jae watched the man who'd stood at his wedding stand instead in front of him, with absolutely nothing left to hide behind. "I gave you everything," Min-jae said quietly. "A decade, my trust, my son's naming ceremony, and you spent every second of it deciding how best to burn it down." Ji-hoon didn't deny it. There was almost something like relief on his face, the specific exhaustion of a man who'd been performing loyalty so long he'd nearly forgotten what honesty felt like, even ugly honesty. "You were always going to choose blood over merit," he said. "I built half of what you have. I was never going to inherit any of it just for being good at my job." "You could have asked," Min-jae said. "You never asked." "Men like me don't get asked," Ji-hoon said. "We get replaced." There was no version of the syndicate's laws that let a man like that simply walk away, and Min-jae didn't pretend otherwise. What happened to Ji-hoon after that night stayed within the organization's own quiet justice, the kind that never made headlines and never needed to. Some debts get paid in ways courtrooms don't handle. Naomi didn't ask for details, and Min-jae didn't offer them. What she asked for instead, 3 days later, standing in the nursery with morning light falling across their son's crib, was something harder for a proud man to give. I need you to understand something, she said. The DNA results never should have needed to exist. I shouldn't have had to stand in a hospital hallway proving something a decade of marriage should have already settled. You didn't just doubt a letter, Min-jae. You doubted me. Ji-hoon built the lie, but you're the one who chose to believe it over 10 years of proof standing right next to you. I know, he said, and for once there was no defense in it, no explanation reaching to soften the truth. I was afraid, and fear made me stupid in exactly the way he was counting on. Then don't be stupid again, she said, because I won't run every test a second time. I did it once to prove a fact. I won't do it again to prove that I'm still worth trusting. He nodded, and it was the most honest thing he'd done in this entire story. No grand gesture, no dramatic declaration, just a quiet promise from a man who finally understood that some kinds of trust, once broken, only survive on the strength of what you do next, not what you say now. Their son stirred in his crib, and Naomi lifted him, and for a moment the three of them stood together in the soft morning light, the empire outside the window quieter than it had been in years. One traitor gone, one truth settled, one marriage standing on ground that was, for the first time in a long while, honestly solid instead of merely assumed. If you were Naomi, could you have forgiven him this fast, or would trust like that take longer to rebuild than one quiet morning in a nursery? Comment below and let us know. And if you believe loyalty should be proven, not just assumed, hit subscribe, because the next story might just test someone you're rooting for even harder than this one did.